Thank you for viewing my alternate submission for our sync session number 3 on regulatory policy recommendations. In this sync session, I'm going to cover the regulatory policy that I will have some recommendations for. That's going to be DNSSEC, and I'm going to go through why it matters and what I recommend. Something to understand in this presentation is that it's building on the research done for regulatory analysis in the previous sync session. In that sync session, the idea was to have an application of a policy, which I chose DNSSEC, and apply it to the research that I'm doing, which is a way to make the ATO process, or the authority to operate process, work better. So we have some context. The engineers in the Internet Engineering Task Force, IETF, they knew that DNS needed a stronger authentication. So they put the effort into fixing that problem, and that was by way of using digital signatures based on PKI, and the result of that was DNSSEC. So it amounted to a stronger authentication, protecting information in the DNS zones as it passed back and forth. So the zone owner uses the zone's private key to sign in DNS data, and then they generate digital signatures over that data. And what that added was that data origin could be authenticated, and so it allowed the people who received that to know that it came from where it was supposed to come from, and it also protected the integrity of the data, so that people could know that the data had not been modified as it went between zones. It was important to me to note as I'm doing this research that it has application not just for understanding what DNSSEC is, but how I'm looking at not just applying regulatory policy, because I'm going to be potentially doing that, but whereas I see problems, looking at how to correct them. So demonstrating this capability is one of the things that we're doing in attaining a PhD. So understanding the regulatory requirements which affect the systems that we're working on, we're obligated to not just understand how that works, but what we would do if we don't agree with what's going on with how a policy is being applied. So why does DNSSEC matter is basically wrapped up in what I just said. It matters for the same reason that the engineers that first developed it identified as it being needful. DNS was not secure, and it matters because we need to be able to ensure that the data that's going from one place to another is both the data that was originally sent and that it hasn't been compromised. So you may have other ways of authenticating the data. You may have multi-factor authentication, you may use an RSA token, you may have strong passwords, but DNSSEC's relevance is that it is the thing that allows you to make sure that your data is being transmitted from one location to the other securely. So the recommendation part of this doesn't have anything to do specifically with a problem about how DNSSEC works, but it ties directly to how it fits into, or being compliant with DNSSEC fits into the ATO process. DNSSEC compliance is something that I have some familiarity with, in addition to other things that are part of the ATO process that are in effect a checklist of things that you have to go down or go through to make sure that an internet website has the authority to operate, hence ATO. And DNSSEC, it's one of the foundational policy or regulatory requirements for pretty much every federal website. Anything that would require an ATO, which is all federal websites, they have to be able to demonstrate that they're DNSSEC compliant. And so I don't have any issue with that, but the fact that configuring a system correctly is something that requires the IT section of your organization to be familiar with how that system works and how it's applied, is not a universal configuration. It's something that is going to be different for different sites depending on how it's being managed and how different information is being transferred, what's at rest, who the servers are, what the service providers are. which content management system you're using, because it all has to fit into that correctly. And trying to accomplish an authority to operate, certifying DNSSEC compliance for someone who doesn't have a knowledge of that system is dysfunctional in its current state. So how the DNSSEC compliance mandate is enforced is actually the policy that I think needs changing. And so regardless of the fact that it tracks encrypted data moving in and out of DNS zones, there's not a universal standard for how it's being applied. And so this misapplication of an enforcement standard is what needs to be fixed. So as I was going through the research, there are some things that are how it can be enforced, but how it can be better accomplished, the recommendation that I have is a standardization of what it requires. There is a list of things that will certify something as DNSSEC compliant, but there's not a template to say which of these things are adequately addressed such that an ATO can be conferred. But I think that there needs to be a consistency for how it's certified with these specific areas: the DNS security introduction and requirements, the resource records for the DNS security extensions, protocol modifications for the DNS security extensions, minimally covering INSEC records and DNSSEC online signing, operational practices, hashed authentication denial of existence, cryptographic algorithm identifier allocation for DNSSEC, and storing certificates in the domain name system. And these that I just said mirror the ones for which DNSSEC has standards. So I'm not just making a recommendation that it becomes standardized, but I'm providing the way that it should be standardized. There should be a checklist that mirrors specifically the articles of DNSSEC compliance that are addressed, that are already identified for how that can be accomplished. Now, an easy answer for why this really matters is that it's a requirement for this course that we come up with a recommendation. But the truth is, the research that I'm doing about making the ATO process better is something that I believe in. I think that the ATO process as it exists is something that's very confusing. It takes a lot longer than it needs to. And as I mentioned earlier, DNSSEC compliance is one of the foundational compliance mandates that an ATO will first apply. So with that being the case, I think all, but specifically for the purpose of this research and presentation, all of them need to have standards that somebody can go into and say, I'm not familiar with your system, but I know that these things need to be correct. And then that way, not only is the certifier able to come in and know what they're looking for, but the system that's being certified can be prepared to deliver those things ahead of time to the person coming in to certify, and there's no confusion about what needs to be accomplished. Along with this, and this will feed back to the ATO process, is a need for documentation that can be consistent as well. So there should be standards, and in the case of DNSSEC, they're already applied for what they require. That needs to be added into the ATO process, and DNSSEC, fortunately, has the tools at hand to make this happen. So that's why I think this really matters. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see you in person for the next sync session.